I got an evening of freedom myself? No.
And I think what's important that I talk about here is we've talked about the important role of government intervention, and particularly around the realm of government services. Well, I come from a consumer perspective, and what is often forgotten about the role of government is the role of government in protecting individuals from harm. And the importance of a government is ensuring a fair marketplace that works to the benefit of both individuals in the community and the community at large. And while certainly there's no question that the public sector has dealt with a tremendous amount of change, job loss, and lower income, I look around the room and I see these media cameras, and I can assure you that if there's any industry that's undergone dramatic changes in the last 2 decades, it's the media industry. So it's a ripple effect, I would say, throughout the economy. So the question we need to ask ourselves is not just what role does government play in terms of providing what we've come to think of as public services. You know, that old-fashioned postal delivery, door to door. But also what's happening in the private marketplace. Now, I've struggled to try and figure out, where am I here now, how to get from point A to point C in my recommendations in less than 10 minutes. So what I want to touch on basically is the changing nature of the marketplace and the role and process of government over the last year. And also a bit about how dramatic growth in new digital technologies has played into so many of these changes in our lives. As I said, making life affordable has sort of been part of the mantra of the Consumers Association of Canada since, if I can give you this date, 1947. And it's always been about raising all boats. And I would also like to say that really consumer organizations across Canada and around the world have always understood the real determinants of health that policymakers and health professionals only recently seem to have discovered. For example, the Consumers Association of Alberta has always understood the importance of a reliable supply of affordable heat and power in the lives and health of families. And again, everyone's touched on the inequalities, and that's very true. It has remarkable ripple effects. Sometimes, though, I think it's almost as if we're seeing ourselves as separate classes in society. The reality is, in my life, in my children's lives, in many of my friends' lives, we've been rich and poor in the same lifetime, depending on all kinds of things can happen. Ups and downs in the economy, in the job sector, certainly the birth of a child that develops disability, an elderly parent that needs support. There are all kinds of things that can take us very quickly from a pretty good life to a not quite so good life. And I think we need to remember that all of us are vulnerable in this. Well, I think you might also be surprised at what's fueling these inequalities, both as consumers in the marketplace and citizens, and how increasingly in the marketplace, as well as within our role as citizens, we're now being sorted into business and economy class customers with different pricing and different levels of services through databases that track our digital footprints and coming and going. Nowadays, decisions about what is available to us in our lives, jobs, insurance, credit, rental accommodation, banking services, schooling, retail goods, and public benefits are made based on these virtual profiles of us that are often in the hands of large commercial entities, and also increasingly in the hands of government. I don't know if many of you are aware, but Loblaws, one of the big retail giants here in Canada, just recently bought out Shoppers Drug Mart, and one of the great attractions for purchasing Shoppers Drug Mart was so that they could access the database in Shoppers Optimum loyalty points programs. So now, I think it's very interesting. Just recently I was looking to doing some research to inform the Consumers Association position on a proposed ban on proprietary inducements for prescription drugs and new professional pharmacy services. And I was pretty buried in the marketing literature around loyalty points programs and social media sites for about a month. Well, I was pretty surprised to find out now we're not only moving to class pricing, we're moving to individual pricing through a combination of information collected through loyalty programs, social media sites, every time we use the plastic, and the geolocator on our cell phone. A little too Orwellian for my taste. Instead of companies competing for our dollars, we will be competing with each other for the best price we can get. So no wonder it's easy to bury our heads. I think the point that I'm trying to make is that what happens in the private marketplace has a profound effect on our lives and public programs and public policies. And believe it or not, if we looked a little closer at many of the things that are happening in the food industry, in the finance industry, in the housing industry, what we'd see is that many of those things are actually driving many of the government decisions that are happening in public policy. I think the other point that I want to make, we talk an awful lot about privatization, but what do we mean by privatization? And I think it might be surprising to you, many different phases of privatization, and I actually am reluctant to use that word in isolation without explaining a little bit more. Because one of the things that has really happened is not just the shift in who pays for services or who provides services, but what's really important is the shift in how services are provided. In the early 1990s, Alberta, the Canadian federal government, and many other provinces jumped on a global bandwagon of something called New Public Management, or Reinventing Government. Anybody read that book back in the early 90s? Here in Canada, we tend to call it something called Alternate Service Delivery, or Smart Government. Well, what's really important to know is these reforms focus on the introduction of private sector values and concepts such as competition, incentivization. Anybody's heard that word recently in Alberta? Standardization. Everything has to be all the same. Performance measures, risk management, outsourcing, and the use of client satisfaction surveys. These reforms also emphasize collaboration with private industry in policy development and implementation. Well, didn't we used to call that collusion? Yeah. Anyways, and certainly a greater role for the private sector in the provision of public services. And this is important because part of this whole philosophy and rhetoric and messaging about the new way of managing government also resulted in citizens being recast as what they called sovereign consumers in the marketplace in a classic economic theory, with narrow economic interests in relation to government instead of individuals who are part of a community with obligations to other people in the community. Very much the point, I think, that Elizabeth made. And I think that's where we really got all our new distaste for the word consumer and consumerism, is because, of course, we understand that our role and our relationship with many of the public services are very different than with other services. And I think what's important to make too, these reforms and the messagings around them has led to what Janice Grostein calls a new cult of efficiency. Has anybody read her book from 2000? And ironically, this was reflected in some comments by Minister Horn in this morning's paper, where he describes the needs and efforts to increase the efficiency in healthcare, but he doesn't describe it, what we're going to be more efficiency at getting at. What is the object of this efficiency? And it's very interesting because in our avowedly secular age, the paramount sin has now become inefficiency, dishonesty, unfairness, injustice, the sins of the past, pale with the cardinal transgression of inefficiency. But we need to remember, I'm going to take an extra couple of minutes here, is that efficiency is not an end, but a means to a valued end. It's not a goal, but it's an instrument to achieve other goals. When it is used as an end in itself, has a value in its own right, and is the overriding goal of public life, it becomes a cult.
Yes.
So I think it's very important that when proposals are being put forward and we hear talk about efficiency, we need to ask, efficient at what? For what purpose? For what goal? Okay, now finally, I'm getting there. How about that? I think we often don't realize that over the last 20 years, Canadians have become more reliant on fewer, more distant, and larger sellers of services. Many consumer protections have been absolutely eliminated. Consumer affairs departments don't exist anymore. Many of the responsibilities for policing the marketplace, and interestingly, via the internet, now even asking Google and Facebook to police citizens, many states are, have shifted from public to private hands. Hard-won Social Security programs to help families weather the inevitable ups and downs of the economy and the normal risks and contingencies of family life have been eroded, leaving us all more dependent on private markets and charity. Now the fascinating thing here is, while we can all cheer that public debt has dropped, family debt has gone through the roof, which has really limited. So when we talk about where we're at, often I always find it interesting that there's a whole group of people that think debt isn't a problem, at least until they run out of credit card room. And one of the interesting things, now I haven't checked in the last couple of years, but historically, while Alberta may have some of the highest wages, it also has some of the highest levels of consumer debt. So when I think about where do we go with the budget, and it's difficult to capture a lot of these kinds of things in a simple solution, one of the things that we have to try and stop the government doing is they keep jumping from the frying pan into the fire. How do they keep doing it? You know, it reminds me of, you know, when you're a kid and you lick the frost off a railing, and how many times do people have to try it before they figure out that maybe that's not a good idea? Okay, so we, 6. Okay. Really? So I think, and I mean, that really came to me as I was looking at the proposed charter for, and I'm a fan of the role of a patient advocate office, but I was looking at the charter for the health advocate, and I thought to myself, my God, who threw this together? Nobody's read a single piece of literature that sort of went into this. But no, we'll just go ahead, throw it out there, something will happen, you know, sooner or later somebody will pick it up. So I guess, I think we need to also think about what role can the government play in not only supporting people or public services, but in reining in the private sector and some of the activities. You know, I sort of quipped to Elizabeth, who I admire tremendously, I should tell you, and but the $84,000 drugs, will someone tell me why we simply sit here and say, oh, it's $84,000. I guess we should all pay $84,000 for this drug. We have a very dysfunctional drug regulatory system and managing the inflation, those kinds of issues. So as well as thinking about what can be done in the public service sector, I would really ask, without knowing or seeing the budget, that there be some elements in there to assure that there's some protection of consumers, of goods and service, to limit the fraud, to limit the harm, and to make sure prices are affordable. Thank you.
Thank you.